Welcome, everyone, to another show with our state senator, Julian Cyr. Today, we're joined also by Skyla Rimple, who's a junior at Mashpee High School. She has an expertise in doing interviews with Senator Cyr, as she's shown previously on our channel. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Skyla, and go ahead.
Alrighty, my name is Skyla Rimple, as you just said, Mashpee High School junior, and very excited to be back here. Senator Cyr and I did one of these 2 years ago, and so it's really cool to kind of come full circle on it. And so, how you doing?
Hi, Skyla. It's so nice to be with you, albeit virtually. Y'all been. How are you doing? Right, this is an interesting time to be in school and a student, and it's been a pretty tough 13, 14 months. But I'm glad to see that you're back in school and back in the building. Right, you've been in school the whole time, and it's always good to connect. You're always doing fabulous, awesome stuff, and so. Mashpee is very proud, and they should be very proud of you.
Thank you. I know, it's good to connect. I love it too. And so we got a couple questions today. The first one that we're going to start with is, what is the current state of the COVID-19 pandemic on Cape Cod? And, how are you feeling about this upcoming summer season? I work 2 jobs in retail, and we're both anticipating a lot more people this summer than we did last year. And so what's that kind of going to look like?
So of the last, 14 months that we've been in this, right, over a year, I actually feel that the most optimistic I felt, and we're recording this, on the last day of April, right? So I think dates are important. Several weeks ago in March and in early April, Cape Cod really saw what was a third wave, a third spike of COVID-19 cases, and that was really concerning. But the good news is we've really been able to get a handle on those cases and who those cases were among and who they're affecting. The morbidity, mortality of that was actually very different than the prior 2 waves, right? The first wave we saw when the pandemic started here in earnest, last May and April, and March 2020, and then again November, December, January. And that's because we've done such a good job vaccinating the most vulnerable people in our community, particularly older adults. And so Cape Cod actually is leading the Commonwealth in our vaccination rates. 64% of Cape Codders have received at least one dose of COVID-19, and 47% of Cape Codders are fully vaccinated. We are ahead of every other region in the state. The islands are right there with us, and Massachusetts is depending on what metric you look at. Massachusetts is either first in the country or second in the country among big states for vaccination. So that really means that Cape Cod is not only leading the Commonwealth, it's leading the country. And so with that level of vaccination, I'm increasingly confident that we're going to be able to have the vast majority of eligible residents vaccinated before we get into the height of the summer season, and that is so important because we're expecting a pretty gangbuster summer. If you look at reservations and rentals, the demand is very, very high, and so making sure that everyone in our community, but especially essential workers, right, people who are on the front lines. Folks like you, right, who are serving people in hospitality and restaurants and retail, that is so important. So I'm actually confident that before we get into the height of the summer season, we'll have about 75% of our population vaccinated. Of course, young adults and children, so anyone under 16 currently isn't eligible for the vaccination. That's about 17% of our population. And we do know there's some people who are not going to be taking the vaccine at this time, at least. So we think that 85 mark is a good one. We're at 64%, and we basically have 10% more of our population to go, and I think we can do that before the summer starts. So I'm feeling cautiously optimistic. We need to continue to be vigilant, and we need to make sure that we don't have another spike in cases. That's why wearing masks, washing hands, keeping your distance, especially when you're in indoor environments, that's so important.
Yeah, thank you so much. I totally agree with that. I see, oh my gosh, so many more people are getting vaccinated, which is good, but it's inspiring to hear that Cape Cod is leading the state, and then that second figure you kind of pulled in, that if we're leading the state and the state's leading the country, then we're doing so. That's
I mean,
pretty good to hear.
It's taken a lot of work, and initially this rollout, wasn't great, right? So I remember, well back into the end of January and February, where really we had a really unacceptably frustrating rollout. Particularly, the governor and his administration just dropped the ball in a number of things. Having a registration system that didn't allow pre-registration, expecting that older adults could do all of this online. So there was a number of pretty unacceptable things that happened, but fortunately we were able to right the ship. And really, thanks to the folks that we have here on Cape Cod, I think of the Community Health Center at Cape Cod, which, has a location in Mashpee. They have just been ace in vaccinating our most vulnerable residents, particularly homebound residents. Mashpee was actually one of the first towns on Cape Cod who vaccinated all of their homebound residents. That was thanks to the Community Health Center Cape Cod. Also with great partnership from Cape Cod Healthcare. Barnstable County has been doing really great vaccination work at the fairgrounds on 151, which is not technically in Mashpee, but just over the line. It was definitely a challenging, frustrating winter. But really, when you look at it, we've ended up in a position that I'm cautiously optimistic of where we are, and I'm proud of where we are.
How are you able to work through some of those struggles at first with the age technology barrier and the rollout? Like, I know that there was kind of like a national issue which transcended into a state issue, of course, but how were you and the people that you work with able to make it so much better for the Cape, and now we're seeing this accelerated vaccination rate?
So, yes, there was limited supply nationwide, and we had that in Massachusetts. But what we really tried to do is really just hold folks accountable and say, what the heck's going on? When adults over 75 became eligible and the registration site for vaccination crashed, right? That was unacceptable. We were very vocal about saying, hey, look, the mass vaccination sites that the governor is prioritizing, that's not a solution for us. When you have to drive, to Foxborough or Dartmouth, and you live on Cape Cod, that's at least an hour trip one way. If you're in my neck of the woods in the Outer Cape, it can be a 4-hour round trip. And just saying that's unacceptable and coming up with locally based solutions. So basically demonstrating and saying, hey, look, we can pull together our healthcare providers, our county, our local officials, and come up with a plan that we then pitch to the command center to say, hey, look, this is how we can vaccinate Cape Codders. Please make sure that we get the doses. And so that pulling together, real collaborative approach that we really have in this region, I think ultimately served us well. But the winter was really tough. I mean, it was a point where we were getting, my office would average about over 600 voicemails in a 10-day period from constituents. I have a team of 5, right? That there's no way we can call everyone back. And so there's just there was a tremendous amount of need, especially people looking for help with unemployment, questions about other programs and services, a lot of hunger out there. So the winter was really hard. I apologize if you reached out to my office and you didn't hear back. I'm sorry about that. We were just so overwhelmed. But I am glad to see that the ship's righted. And if you look at our numbers, we're looking pretty darn good. And I think that's really important in advance of the summer season.
I do too, and I'm glad that the way that we were able to overcome it was through teamwork. I think you emphasized that a lot, and there's no better way, if you ask me. So I'm really glad
Absolutely.
to hear that. The next thing that I kind of wanted to go into is, so you were recently appointed to this new legislative committee that oversees the state's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I just wanted to hear, how's that going so far? What have you learned? What do you still want to know? How do you feel about it? What's going on there?
So this is a new legislative committee.
And congratulations.
Oh, thank you. So this is the Joint Committee on COVID-19 Emergency Management and Preparedness. And we've actually had several oversight hearings. The first 2 we had in early March, and then again later in March. It got pretty testy between legislators and the governor and his administration really demanding answers. I think we've really been concerned about and focused on ensuring equity in vaccine distribution. So if you look at the data, right, and even here on Cape Cod, white Cape Codders are twice as likely to have been vaccinated than Cape Codders of color. That really is not only unacceptable from an equity perspective, but it's something that we know if we're going to really get a handle on the disease and really stop community spread, you need to make sure that everyone in the community is vaccinated, not just the people who are able to navigate this difficult system. So what the committee really did was sort of shine a spotlight on what wasn't working well, asking really tough questions, and then getting some response on that, right? Sometimes one of the most effective ways where you can make change is actually using oversight, using a bully pulpit a little bit to get some answers, especially when you're in a crisis situation. Legislating can be effective, but legislative work it is a deliberatively slow process, right? Constitutionally, we're meant to be a deliberative body, so it can be hard for us to move fast to pass a law, right? Because you have a bicameral legislature. But what we are really good at is having oversight, asking tough questions, and so the committee is going to continue to do this work. There's some real questions. I have a lot of real questions about why the governor and his administration made a decision to abandon. There was basically 20 years of planning around emergency preparedness around vaccine allocation that flowed through local boards of health and municipalities. They decided to take a different course, a different track on that, and went with these mass vaccination sites. And I have some real sort of questions about that. Really want to understand why, all those years of planning and also all that money that was spent on emergency preparedness. I do want to mention Rep. Dave Vieira, who also represents Mashpee in the House. He's on this committee as well. So Dave and I have been teaming up to ask some of these questions, particularly around emergency management and public health. So lots of work still to do, but am glad to see that the numbers are trending trending now in a positive direction.
Yes, I totally agree with that as well. I just wanted to go deeper on that equity issue. I mean, it's clear to recognize, but what are some of the committee's ideas, or even if there aren't really like set action steps in place, like what is it? I mean, this is just kind of a pretty new situation. What does it look like to provide equity in emergency preparedness? Like what can we on Cape do for that?
So a lot of this is actually about making sure that you have people who are in and of a community doing the work to help get people vaccinated. So what the committee really pushed for, and actually the administration started doing, was spending over $5 million to reach, basically to reach hard to reach populations, to reach immigrant communities, communities of color. Yes, in places like Chelsea and Everett and other communities that were hit really hard by the pandemic. But also we're trying to do that work here on Cape Cod. It means having vaccinators who have language skills other than English, right? Who speak Brazilian Portuguese, who speak Spanish. It ultimately is going to mean, going door to door, neighbor to neighbor. What we really focus on with the homebound program was actually, understanding that if you are homebound or can't travel very far, you're not going to be able to you're certainly not going to be able to get a vaccine at a mass vac site. And let alone even getting down the street can be tough, especially during this pandemic. So working with local EMS, working with the community health center to actually go to people's homes and get folks vaccinated. So it's that real level of sort of granular work that's based, in another community that has community leaders working to advance vaccination. I think that's in part how we've been successful to date. And really, when I look at, we've got about 10% more of our population to go here on Cape Cod. How are we going to reach those people? We got to be as accessible as possible, right? We've got to have walk-in vaccination clinics available. We've got to have, language, you got to have language skills, in addition to English. Those are sort of some of the pieces we're working on now. That's really what equity looks like.
I didn't even really think about the language barrier and how important that large Portuguese population on Cape, and so especially in like areas like Hyannis and Yarmouth, and so that was a really good point on that. I'm curious if you've seen any trends in vaccine skepticism with people of color or of immigrant communities, and if they're trending that, how you plan on, or you or just the committee plan on kind of like respecting people's opinions, but also like trying to accelerate the Cape. How does that look?
So overall on vaccine hesitancy, broadly, we don't have a really vaccine hesitant population, at least compared to elsewhere in the country. So Massachusetts is tied with Hawaii as far as the state with the least vaccine hesitancy. And I think that certainly applies here on Cape Cod. We have, Cape Cod is, the oldest county. Barnstable County is the oldest county in New England. And so I think we have a vast majority of our residents who have been really eager to get this vaccine, who are in line to get vaccinated. I think when you look at hesitancy among communities of color, there's actually not, when you look at the polling on this and other information, there's actually not a marked sort of increase or difference around hesitancy. It really is about access, right? Who has access to a healthcare provider or someone they trust? They know where they can get it. If you're an essential worker, right, particularly going into the summer season, you work 6, sometimes 7 days a week, you have a half day off. If there isn't a vaccine clinic where you can get a vaccine, or better yet, a vaccine that comes to you, you might not be able to get it. So that's how we're thinking about reaching these populations. There is hesitancy among immigrant communities, particularly when concerned about having government involved. This is very much a holdover from the prior federal administration and a real concern about that. But what we've been trying to do is make sure that we're meeting people where they are, and we're having this led by healthcare providers and by people in their community. And when you look at vaccine hesitancy and how you move beyond vaccine hesitancy, what we know is that when someone you really trust and have a relationship with and who is part of your community, that's one of the most effective things that overcomes vaccine hesitancy.
Yeah, that familiar face kind of. I appreciate that a lot. So thank you. Our next question is, how are you feeling about the upcoming budget debate for the next fiscal year? I'm sure it's going to look different than the one we just experienced, and kind of what will be different that we can expect from the last year.
So we're in the midst of taking up the fiscal year 2022 budget. This is the fiscal year that starts July 1st. The House just took up and passed their budget. The Senate, we're going to take up our budget and pass our budget right before Memorial Day. Massachusetts broadly is actually doing better than we expected. So we were really concerned in the pandemic about a steep recession, about a real decline in revenue. And while we saw a pretty steady drop in revenue, last spring, the rebound has been quicker than we expected. And so we are in better fiscal shape than I certainly ever expected we would be. It looks like we're going to be able to balance this budget largely based on Massachusetts resources. And in addition, we have, $4.5 billion in resources coming to Massachusetts from the federal government through President Biden's rescue plan. But those are dollars, we'll rely on a little bit, but we're really able to meet our needs with existing resources. That means this $4+ billion we're going to be able to rely on, for infrastructure projects, for climate adaptation, maybe for wastewater, other sort of big sort of one-time challenges that we have in the region. This federal money is a big deal, but it is one-time dollars. And so if you rely on one-time dollars to balance your budget, it ultimately results in a fiscal cliff in following years, right? Because you can't count on those resources forever. So we're really trying to balance the books and have a fiscally responsible budget in Massachusetts, and then take these additional federal resources and use them to address some of our biggest problems. From my perspective, that's climate, adaptation, resilience, that's housing, that's wastewater. And so we're going to be aiming to get those resources here in our communities like Mashpee and across the region.
Yeah, I'd definitely be more interested in hearing about how this new money coming in is going to relate to our climate, because that's a big issue on Cape Cod.
Huge issue.
What we can have for that.
And Skyla, we just took major action. We just took major action
tell me about
on climate change. So the legislature passed and the governor finally signed into law an act relative to a net zero carbon future. This puts Massachusetts on a pretty strict roadmap to get to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Every 5 years, actually, the state has to meet a certain benchmark, a target. We expand procurements for offshore wind. We implement what's called a stretch code and really begin to address where a lot of our emissions stem from. And one of the hardest areas is actually in our built environment. So we know what to do when it comes to transportation. We know what to do when it comes to energy generation. But in our built environment, right, our homes, our residential buildings, our commercial buildings, there's a lot of transition that needs to happen there. And there's going to be a lot of cost with that. The bill also looks at environmental justice communities, transportation credits. We also do some work on efficiency appliances. So lots of sort of good things. This is a pretty historic bill, and lots of work ahead. I'm really hoping that we can now use some of these federal stimulus dollars and relief dollars to then apply those to meet the challenge of, say, of greening our homes. When we build, new affordable housing, that we're able to, have these be greener buildings that are, net closer to net zero in their own carbon emissions, right? But we're going to need some help to do that. So lots of good stuff on climate. We've got a long more way to go here, right? As you well know, you've been a real activist, an instigator here on climate. I've also filed legislation, a trio of bills to really further expand Massachusetts' role in offshore wind and make sure that Massachusetts and specifically the Cape and Islands are really in the driver's seat with far offshore wind, which really has the potential to power over half the Commonwealth, and really become an export for the Commonwealth if we build out all that we can.
Oh, wow.
We're busy.
I know, it's all such good things to hear. I'm so glad.
Well, it's a consequential time, right? You can't rest on your laurels.
We can't. We still got a lot more work to do, but especially with housing too. I would love to hear about how the pandemic has affected the way that the Cape deals with housing, and then some positive steps we're planning on taking.
So we had a housing crisis before the pandemic, and in the pandemic, Absolutely. It has just been exacerbated, right? People want a piece of Cape Cod. They want a second home, a third home. And really, people like you and me, right, just can't compete in that market. Residential property values, residential property sales on Cape Cod increased 19% in the last year. That is shocking. The median home price for all residential homes is $495,000, nearly $500,000. That's certainly something that most working Cape Codders cannot afford. So we've got to get really serious about housing production here. The number one issue that I'm hearing from both business owners and employees going into the summer season is workforce. They don't have enough workforce. So we've got to get real serious about housing production. One of the ways that we make housing production happen is through wastewater. And so really tackling the wastewater crisis that we have, particularly with sewer systems, that actually allows you to build more densely, more environmentally friendly. How we've developed on Cape Cod in the last 20, 30, 40 years, right, which is much more of a suburban development scheme, actually ecologically has kind of been a bit of a disaster, right, because they rely on Title V septic systems, which then pump nitrogen into our estuaries, phosphorus into our freshwater ponds. This is a huge problem in Mashpee that folks are aware of and working on. So really, if you look at what's happening around housing, we've got to get really serious about housing production. And we've got to get really serious about wastewater, because wastewater actually enables us to build the housing that we need, and also to have housing that's sort of consistent with our, Cape Cod villages and denser little villages that we have. So housing, wastewater, this is sort of the really big challenge coming out of the pandemic.
I'm really glad that you're able to recognize the way that the three work together, and that you can't have sustainable and equitable housing without good environmental support, and how the way that housing influences the environment. And so I think it's really good that you're working on the two. I'm curious though, with the housing, you mentioned people with their second home and their third home. What about people with their first home? How is homelessness on the Cape kind of been accelerated? And are there any action steps on that end?
Well, we're seeing a real increase in housing insecurity. So, maybe you rent an apartment, right? And if your landlord decides to transition that apartment, from a year-round rental to a short-term rental, right, you're going to get kicked out, and you can't find another place to live, and you may end up leaving Cape Cod. So when I talk about housing production, I'm talking about we need, more year-round rental units, and we need also, we need to incentivize and make sure that existing rentals, especially affordable rentals, are staying. They're not getting converted. And I think we need to recognize that working Cape Codders are just not going to be able to compete in this real estate market, right? It really increasingly is a market that is geared towards, second homeowners, and there's, look, there's some benefit from that. There's a lot of economic activity that's generated from that, but I think we need to be honest that just everyday Cape Codders are not able to buy a home and not able to have a place to rest their head unless they get some help. And I think if our towns don't get serious about housing production, we're really going to erode our communities. These are not going to be year-round communities, and you can really see that, in my neck of the woods where I live on the Outer Cape, which the Outer Cape and the islands are just even so much more expensive than a place like Mashpee, and we're losing people. I know a dozen people who are leaving the Outer Cape this summer because they couldn't figure out housing. So we really need to be serious about housing, because what's going to happen is yes, we'll see some level of homelessness, but we'll see more housing insecurity, and then people just deciding, look, I can't stay here, I'm moving off Cape because I just can't compete in this market. I can't afford a home. I can't find an affordable place to rent. So we've got to stay laser focused on this, and this is a problem. Most of these are decisions that are made at the local level, right? So it's not something that we can necessarily fix on Beacon Hill.
I wasn't sure if Bill popping in, if he had something to add, or if we were.
Bill's probably telling us to wrap up. No.
Yeah, I am back in. I think we've got a lot to chew on for the next duration of time, and appreciate your time with us, Senator. And Skyla, a great job as always. You're amazing, and I appreciate that. So thank you, and we'll see you next time.
Awesome, Bill. Thanks for making this happen. Skyla, always a pleasure to see you, and good luck with the summer season, the end of the school year, and gosh, you're going to be a senior next year, so looking forward to seeing what good trouble you'll instigate then.
All right, excellent. So
thank you so much. Always so good to see you.